Welcome to Good History, the podcast brought to you by the Oklahoma State University History Department and inspired by the esteemed historian and Oklahoma native Dr. John Hope Franklin's line that a good historian is a moralist at heart. We bring together people from diverse walks of life who research history, studied history, read history, and think about history. We want to know what history means to them, and we want to ask them a big question. If studying history doesn't necessarily make us feel good, how does knowing more of it make our lives better? Hello and welcome. I'm Brian Hosmer, professor and head of the OSU History Department, and your host for this episode. My guests are Loren and LeeAnn Dreadfulwater. Jen and LeeAnn come to us through Cherokee Film, a multifaceted media enterprise of the Cherokee Nation that sponsors television, film, education, cultural engagement, and historical work. This blend speaks to our goals at Good History. Loren is Senior Director of Cherokee Film and Executive Producer and host of Osiyo, Voices of the Cherokee People, and Salagi, Wherever We Are. I imagine many of our listeners know you from Osiyo, which we'll touch upon during our podcast. LeeAnn Dreadfulwater is a historical consultant and researcher and project manager for Cherokee Film, who also has a long career with the nation itself. So both are citizens of Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. So welcome to Good History, Jen and LeeAnn. And allow me to begin by asking each of you to share a little bit of your background. You're both from Oklahoma, but have distinct paths, I think, to this point where your lives have converged. So maybe we'll begin with LeeAnn and then move to Jen from there.
Thank you for having us. Well, I grew up as an Okie from Muskogee, so that's the first thing to know. But my grandparents, my father's family, the Cherokee side of the family, were always in Tahlequah, Delaware County, those areas. And it's hard to be a Cherokee and be involved with those things without getting somewhat involved in the history of it as well. So that's something that I'd always known. And when I was finally ready to do adult work, big job, that I actually went and applied for my first job with Cherokee Nation. And that was back in the early 90s. And so I've done lots of things with Cherokee Nation since then. I worked in the communications office, fielding all kinds of requests from media. In fact, that's where I met Loren. She was a reporter and was coming in, and I set up some kind of an interview for her with our chief. From there, I kind of got hooked into all of the operators at Cherokee Nation going, we have a weird call and we don't know what to do with it. And they would just sort of drop them off onto me. And so I got where I was answering all of those. And about the time that we started doing Osiyo TV and having that on, I was starting to get questions from there. You know, we're doing these almanacs, and can you vet this for us? And can you see if this is, see if this is correct? And shortly after that, they said, why don't you just come to work with us full time? So that was in late 2019. So I have been there ever since, and I have loved every minute of it.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Jen.
Yeah, Osiyo Wado. Hello, and thank you for having us. So I am the Senior Director of Cherokee Film and the host of Osiyo, Voices of the Cherokee People, and have been working for my tribe for 10 years now. I came into this in a little bit of a different way as a journalist, as LeeAnn mentioned. So I grew up in Oklahoma. I went to Booker T. Washington High School here in Tulsa, started in television production in high school at Booker T, and then got a journalism degree, worked in television journalism, ended up as a statewide investigative reporter and news anchor for Griffin, which has News 9 in Oklahoma City and News on 6 in Tulsa, the CBS affiliates, and really started doing long form journalism through that investigative work. So I would work on stories for months and they would be long form, almost like documentaries. So when Cherokee Nation called and said they wanted to start a television show, I jumped at the opportunity and we started the docuseries Osiyo, and then just absolutely fell in love with my job. And our leadership was always saying, okay, Osiyo is great. Yes, you've won Emmy Awards, but what's next? And it was like, oh my gosh, this is such a great problem to have.
Right.
So we said, well, we can be doing more for representation, Cherokee representation, but also representation for other tribes. And so we started the Cherokee Nation Film Office, which morphed and is now Cherokee Film. And we do all sorts of initiatives. But when it comes to history, we touch on it a lot through our docuseries, through, other other productions that we're working on now, and really everything we do.
Yeah. Well, that's really fascinating, sort of how those pieces came together. And I'd like to double back a little bit on history. And so, Jen, how did some of these things sort of emerge a little while back? When did you start thinking about history or thinking historically, and particularly in your particular context?
So I grew up not loving history class, but I loved just history in real life. So my great grandmother, who lived to be 103,
Wow.
and she was rocking and rolling until she was 100. It was just always really interesting to sit and hear her perspectives and hear her stories about things, because she had lived through so much. And her house up on Monkey Island is like a time capsule, and there's just a lot to ask about. So that's really, as a child, when history started entering my everyday life. I was not a fan of history class. I thought it was boring. And I
don't take that personally.
I'm sorry. I think I had the wrong professors.
Of course.
I wished that I liked it more. And it wasn't until after I graduated and started working into my professional career that I was like, I really realized that how much of a role history played in everything I did, and began really, as a journalist, starting to study history on my own.
Nice.
And then working for Cherokee Film and Cherokee Nation, like LeeAnn said, once you start working for a tribal nation, then, history goes along with everything that you do. And so I've just been a sponge for the last 10 years.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, I think for me, a little bit different from Jen, I absolutely loved history, loved my history classes. We had the most wonderful high school history teacher. Shout out to Mr. Jane, who could make anything in history sound interesting. He would tell it in story fashion and just get us completely hooked in. And aside from that, my mother was a big fan of antiques, and everything in the house had a story. She never met an antique shop or a junk shop that she didn't like. And, so we were constantly stopping, and she was constantly pointing out to me what things were. And so you get kind of interested in that. Beyond that, my dad's sister, my aunt, who was Cherokee, was also kind of the family genealogist and the family historian. And I guess she saw a little bit of that in me, and she spent lots of time on the phone trying to get me interested in, which family member did what and when and so forth. And I kind of got hooked on that, got really interested in finding out which of my family had come across from the Trail of Tears, where they had lived back in the old Cherokee Nation, what they did when they got here to Indian Territory, and just, really couldn't get enough of diving into that to see what did those ancestors do and what was life like for them. I had a great-great-grandfather who lived through, his mother was a Trail of Tears survivor, and he lived all the way through the turn of the century. He lived through allotment. He lived through seeing radio and television, seeing airplanes, seeing World War I and World War II. By the time, I can't imagine, I wish I could go back and talk to him and ask him about all of those things.
That's really stunning, right? To sort of think about both the length of time there, but also the rapidity of change, right? That are all kind of there. I'm hearing from both of you this really interesting kind of connection between sort of learning about history, but in the context of your community. And maybe if you could reflect a little bit on how those things seem to come together, reinforce one another, because you both talked about that.
So I would say, being a Cherokee Nation citizen, we are very well documented people because of the federal government and their policies having to do with our tribe. And so I think that when we look back at, when you're a Cherokee person, where does your history begin? I think that we are not only well documented and can find our family and our ancestors through history in documentation, but we also are a community that has a very strong oral history tradition. And so when we talk about being Cherokee and where we come from, we don't just go back to what we find on paper, but we have the oral histories and traditions that we go back to time immemorial, where creation started. And those are things that when we're looking at history and being Cherokee, we go all the way back there. But I think that in today's society, it's really great to know your history and where you come from. And we feel very grateful to be Cherokee and to know those things, because there are so many Americans and other people who don't know that about themselves. And so it's not something that we take for granted, and we reflect back on it a lot, because as we all know, you can learn a lot from history, and it helps us, I think, to move forward too as Cherokee.
And to add to that, I think so much of our history is embodied in these small communities that we have. And throughout the Cherokee Nation's boundaries today, there are about 100 small communities that are basically Cherokee communities. And those are places where, our language still lives and thrives. There are places where people are still telling stories, that the old stories are coming through, that oral history that Jen's talking about. And, that's the thing that keeps all those flames of our history going. And it's just an amazing thing to see. I think, we want to nurture that. We never want that to go away, but it is something that is somewhat endangered as we start losing our language and things go out of people's memory. And I think for us, part of what we do, I think we see as a little bit of a service back to our community in trying to help keep some of that alive.
Yeah. And that really leads me to sort of a next direction I want to go, because one of the guiding principles for our podcast is this concept of history work, or what history does. And we're talking a little bit about what history is, maybe sort of the who and the what, and what, history work is sort of more of an action kind of thing, right? And history, what kind of thing history does and what kind of things that we do. So maybe I can ask you a little bit about kind of history work. And what I mean more specifically is, it seems to me that Cherokee Films in its many aspects enacts this broad concept that history does something, that it has an effect. So maybe we can begin talking a little bit about that. And Jen, I'd like you to begin talking a little bit about Cherokee Film and this larger enterprise as history taking action, history doing something.
I'm going to try my best to answer this, but I think what you're asking is how we are taking action, utilizing our history today through our projects at Cherokee Film. So our history, well, I can just go through the branches of the Cherokee Film ecosystem. So Cherokee Film Productions, when we're creating Cherokee-specific content, we're creating Osiyo TV, which is our Emmy award-winning docuseries that has a Cherokee Almanac segment in it. And so the way that works for us is we get to tell our history from our perspective. So a lot of people, for example, may have heard of the Oklahoma land run, and they think it was just a free-for-all on no man's land. Well, actually, that was Cherokee territory, and there's a story behind that. And so we did a Cherokee Almanac that tells the story from our perspective, and it's opened a lot of eyes. And that's the goal of what we are doing with a lot of our productions, is to say, consider a perspective that you haven't before, because we haven't been allowed to tell our own stories and we haven't had the means. Well, now we do. And so we also look at things like, currently we're working on several animations, 3D animations that tell some of our creation stories. And we'll be able to put those out into the world and offer these different perspectives that haven't seen the light of day for many people outside of our Cherokee communities. And then when you look at Cherokee Film Commission, historically, Hollywood has misrepresented Native Americans. And so we have all kinds of initiatives through our Film Commission to increase Native American representation in front of the camera, behind the camera, because what happens is when you have Native Americans contributing to those projects and having a voice on those sets or in those boardrooms, meeting rooms, writers' rooms, then it creates, again, that more authentic representation.
Right.
And so then we have our Cherokee Film Institute, which we are waiving tuition for Native Americans to learn how to get into film and media. And so that is also because of historical misrepresentation.
Indeed.
And us taking and creating a new history for ourselves. And that's really, we say that at Cherokee Film, we're innovating narrative sovereignty.
Yes.
And that is something we take very seriously because we haven't had the opportunity before. And it's exciting work to be doing. And history plays a big role in that.
I love that concept, narrative sovereignty. Really think it's powerful. And maybe you can tell me a little bit more about it since you just brought it up. I think it's amazing.
Yeah. So essentially, what it boils down to is that we're taking control of our own story and our own narrative. And, if someone wants to portray Cherokee people and Native Americans inaccurately, we'll hold them accountable. And we will also create a new way forward in the proper manner to show and illustrate to the world how Native Americans and Cherokees should be represented in film and media. And we can help people who don't understand. Some people just, they just don't know what they don't know, but we can show them the way and be a creative force for good and help others. And so that's really what we're doing. And the innovation part is really exciting because we innovate in everything we do. I mean, LeeAnn and I have spent many hours just like really trying to figure out a new way to do things. It's really hard. Like, how are we going to tackle this situation? And we innovate through our conversations and our initiatives and just the way that we do things every day at the Film Commission specifically. But then we also, through productions and through the studios, we get to innovate with technology.
Right.
And so Cherokee people have always been early adopters of technology from the printing press in the early 1800s and throughout history. And so Cherokee Film, we like to think of as an extension of that. And so we have cutting edge technology in our studios and we get to innovate that way. So we're not trying to catch up with anybody. We're leading the way.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, and adding the innovate because it really sort of speaks directly to some of the pernicious stereotypes about Indigenous people, that they're backward looking, not innovative, bound by whatever this word tradition even means, right? And so I think it really powerfully hits that too. So LeeAnn, I want to kind of follow up on the history work a little bit and sort of another aspect of this. And when I think about history work, what I try to do is also distinguish between what people like me do, professional historians working in universities, and what most people who are in history work do. And one of the things I tell my students is that there are historians everywhere, and only a tiny percentage are people like me, right? And most people. So from the perspective of where you work, maybe tell me about what history work looks like for you.
Oh, goodness. Well, Jen covered some of this in that we feel a true calling to try to make sure that our history is told correctly and properly. Because I'll be very honest, most people think we're dead.
Mm-hmm.
They just think that's Indians are in the history book.
Mm-hmm.
And if they think about Cherokees at all, the thing they probably think about is, oh, they went on the Trail of Tears. And then it's sort of like they went on the Trail of Tears and they got there and boom. And then there's sort of nothing else after that. And so I think, a lot of the work that I find really gratifying is looking into how did we rebuild that, what did that age after relocation look like?
Yeah.
How did we survive other things all the way up through the Civil War? The American Civil War was not our war. We were not a part of the United States,
Right.
and we were drug into it anyway. And it decimated the Cherokee Nation, probably arguably worse than it did a lot of places in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
Again, we were resilient. We built back from that. And then, so there are all kinds of things that can be told and be made very interesting to people. We also have lots and lots of, we're a huge tribe. We have lots of Cherokee Nation citizens who are not super well versed in the history of their own nation. And so I think we feel like this is a calling to try to keep those stories out there and educate those folks, but also to the larger public. So we really are trying to dig those things up. I get really excited when I go down a rabbit hole and find something new that we hadn't considered. And, let's see, and Jen can tell you, I usually end up popping that up on one of our teams or sending out an email or something. Guess what I found? And then,
spoken like a real historian right there.
Thank you.
But our whole staff gets just as excited about it as she does.
Yeah.
We love it.
Yeah. And that's what's really fun, is that I know that they are going to love what this, this thing is and go, oh, that's so cool. How can we use that? And that goes back to the innovation that we're talking about.
Exactly.
So how can we take these things that they're laying on a dusty shelf somewhere, or, they're back in someone's memory. How can we take that and bring it out and spread it out into the sunshine and get people excited about it like we are.
I love that. Yeah, that's kind of what I mean by history work, right? It's doing it. There's an action component to this, which I think is
Yes.
really fascinating and important. So I want to talk a little bit about media and kind of dig into that a little bit more. And I want to begin by talking about Osiyo, Voices of the Cherokee People, and which I think is a very powerful vehicle for exploring history and culture. You've been talking a little bit about it already. I want to urge all of our listeners to tune in if you have not. It's great. So maybe, Jen, we can sort of begin with you and kind of walk us through, how does this work?
Yeah. So each episode of Osiyo Voices of the Cherokee People is 30 minutes long and consists of 3 what we call feature stories, which are you have profiles of Cherokee Nation citizens that are doing amazing things in some way or another. Some of them are local to the Cherokee Nation reservation. Some of them live in all corners of the United States or other parts of the world. And then we also have this an almanac within that episode and a language lesson. So that format has changed a little bit here in recent times as we're focusing on feature-length documentaries, but we will always have these 30-minute episodes, and you can find them all on our website, and you can watch just the almanac sections if you want, or just one story if you want. And so really the way that we choose our stories is we have a long list that has got about 300 names on it. and it has a little blurb about what they do. And we go through that kind of at the beginning and pre-production season, and all of the producers who work on the show choose kind of their favorites and why they want, and talk about why they want to do them. And then we just whittle away from there. Sometimes we want to do people's stories because we'll be able to capture something that's happening right now, that is happening in their lives that's really exciting. And then when it comes to the historical segments, really we have we started the docuseries by just choosing what was interesting and what we thought needed to be told first. And then we said, let's start doing this in a more organized fashion. So in one of our seasons, we said, let's start from the beginning and go through time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when LeeAnn's work really kicked in. And so she actually created this amazing timeline that we have on our website, osiyo.tv. You can click on it and it's interactive. And so you can kind of point your cursor what point in history, and it'll pop up an Osiyo TV story or an article or something. So it's really fantastic. But we have gone all the way through history up until modern times. And then our goal is to eventually take those historical segments and add more to it and do an entire docuseries just on the history of the Cherokee Nation. Yeah. So that's one of the things that we're doing with our history.
Great.
And just to add to that, I think when the show first started, and I was not involved in that part of it at first, but was kind of over on the sidelines watching with interest. And oh boy, so the first few almanacs in the first probably couple of seasons were pretty basic.
Mm-hmm.
They would be usually like Jen doing a voiceover and somebody popping up some historical images, and then it kind of grew a little bit organically. I think too the reason for that may have been, we don't know how long we're going to be able to keep doing this show. And that's another reason for tackling those big things up front. And then learning that, hey, this is going to continue. We've been around for 10 years, which is so exciting. And we've been able to tell a lot of stories in that time. So from there, we were able to have the luxury of picking things that were, a little more obscure and giving them some focus and spending a little more time on them. They sort of evolved from being about a minute long to up to 6 or 7 minutes long, and just finding all of the assets and things that go with that, but also finding people that can help us tell that story, finding those subject matter experts and going out and saying, would you talk about this on camera for us? And some of them react with horror. Most of them are pretty happy to come do that with us. And
I was just going to ask you that, how people respond. So you just answered it like, why do people, right?
Some of us are pretty shy about being on camera. They've stuck me on camera a couple of times, and I can tell you, as soon as I have a camera in front of me, I turn into awkward girl.
But she's so passionate about history, and most historians and academics that we interview are.
Absolutely.
That you never would know that.
Right.
Yeah. And so once we get them talking, and we try to give them some questions up front and say, this is what we really would like for you to talk about. And then I think at that point, most of them forget there's a camera and are just excited to tell the stories of the things that they know about, because
Yeah.
everybody's got something specific that is sort of their, close to their heart.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, that's what makes it powerful.
Can I add to
Of
that
course.
too, that one of the things that we have always tried to do from the beginning of Osiyo TV was to be very conscientious about the female to male ratio
Mhm.
as far as the people that we are highlighting on our show. I think we all know that history has often shown a light on males a lot more than females. And so we actually have made it a point to dig for stories about women that made an impact in Cherokee Nation. And we've brought several stories to light that no one knew about these women before, or very few people did. And now they have a following, these women from history. So like Mary Golda Ross and Wahila LaHaye, and the list goes on. And sometimes those are kind of hard to really
are.
go and mine and find the information and then the visuals to go with it. But our team is always, we never shy away. And if we don't have the visuals, we figure out what to do. And so we've hired actors to do reenactments because we really are passionate about telling the stories of women through history too.
I'm so glad you brought that up, and I commend you because it can be difficult, and the material can be fragmented, and also it just runs against some basic assumptions. Why are you telling this story? And I think that's so important. And you're right to have prefaced it with sort of a general statement about history, how history's been told. That also sort of speaks even more directly to the way Native history has been told. And we think about historians and chroniclers and anthropologists from the 19th through into the 20th century who only spoke to men. And when they visited communities, and they weren't necessarily representing what the men said, but they never spoke to women or rarely spoke to women. And then they would extrapolate from what they heard from three men and say, the Cherokee, this is such, right? They would assume that that's everything. And so it speaks really directly to a sort of a larger issue, and then one that's really particular to the way that we understand Indigenous communities, right? Who's telling these stories to whom? And they're usually men talking to men.
And originally in our culture, it would have been the women.
Exactly.
Because women held a very powerful place historically in the Cherokee world. And so that sort of tipped over around the first part of the 19th century,
right,
as we became sort of more assimilated. But, originally that would have been who was passing along these stories and taking care of everything and making sure that people, had the knowledge that they needed to continue.
That makes it doubly ironic, right?
Mm-hmm.
In a troubling way, right?
Yeah.
That you sort of add the historical and cultural truth to that, and then layer on top of it a male-centered history, right? That's I think speaks volumes. And again, I think that sounds like narrative sovereignty to me.
That's one of the things that I think it is absolutely a reason for us to be focusing on narrative sovereignty, but it's also something I think that a lot of non-Native Americans simply cannot seem to grasp. And you have to really find a good partner who's willing to listen to you, to understand. When we're talking about allowing Native Americans to tell our own stories, some people might be offended and think, well, I can tell a story. I can be sensitive to these things, but it's so layered, and there's so much there. They have to really dive in and fully understand the Native American experience to be able to think that they have what it takes to tell stories that are inclusive of our entire perspective.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Amen. I think that's really powerful and spot on, right? And so, right, there's another kind of aspect of negotiating and talking and all of that. So let me ask you a quick question that sort of follows up on that a little bit and then move in kind of a slightly different direction. And so when you are assembling the show and when you've been assembling them, how do you imagine your audiences? And I mean it, I use the plural on purpose.
How do I imagine them?
Yeah, who are they?
Oh, yeah. Well, so that was a big question when we started the show, right? When we start marketing, the marketing team says, who is your audience? And we said, well, let's think about that. Everyone. All the eyeballs, no matter where they are or how they're viewing us. And really, over time, we've done a lot of research and we know who our audiences are. And so I will say it's pretty simple. We are creating a historical archive for our people. our audience is Cherokee Nation citizens first. And that is something we take a great pride in and want to make sure that the stories that we're telling now are, they're archival. They're telling our story that no one will ever be able to say that we don't know because we're doing this. And so that's our first audience. And then next audience is Native Americans. A lot of people who are citizens of other tribes tell us all the time they love watching Osiyo. It reminds them of their family, or they just really enjoy seeing Native representation by Natives on television or online. And then our other audience is non-Natives, and we get a lot of really fantastic feedback from people who watch us on public television. We're nationally distributed on public television stations, and we get people who tell us that they just never knew how much they would love learning about the Cherokee Nation, and that they just can't. They watch it all the time. They can't peel away. They have no reason to. They don't have any connection to Cherokee people or Native people at all, but they just love it. And they think it's entertaining and informative. And then of course, people all around the world. There are particular populations around the world that have what I would call kind of a fascination with Native American culture. And it feels really good to know that we have a lot of viewers in those countries that are learning what it really means to be Cherokee. And it's probably not what they have imagined.
You're also pushing, right. They're drawn in by kind of set of stereotypes and Hollywood
Correct.
images, but then you have the opportunity to educate them a little bit after they've tuned in.
Yes.
Nice.
Yeah.
So, LeeAnn, you've had some other experiences working with the tribe in other capacities. And I'm really interested in kind of maybe flipping this a little bit and thinking about how the work that you're doing now interlinks with or supports this larger project of nation building, right? Because this is something that's happening with the Cherokee Nation, but also across Native America, right? Sort of what is this project of nation building? And I'm really curious about how these pieces sort of fit into that.
Well, I think, we're sort of a small cog in a very big sort of a mechanism that's going on out there with, as many tribes as there are in the US and Canada. And we are very, very fortunate in that, we're the largest tribe in the US. We have the resources to be able to do what we're doing. And like Jen said, we don't ever take that for granted. It's up to us to sort of set that direction. If we are the ones that have those great concepts out there that we can share, or we have the equipment or those kinds of things, we get a lot of great support from our government side, from the executive branch, judicial branch, and legislative branch, which is just our tripartite government that we have. And we hear lots of good things from them, because they've got their ear out there. The
Right.
council members are hearing things from their constituents. And so, I think it builds in that way. It sort of is a ripple effect that goes out. And, some ways it's just very organic, but, we also try to be as strategic as we
Nice.
can about this. And we do take guidance from our government side. If they're saying, hey, we'd like people to know a little bit more about this or this, what can you do?
Yeah.
And so, we look into how can we make that interesting to people? How can we, get a point across without being preachy or overbearing about it? How can we, just lay something out there in a way that breaks it down? We always hear people
Right.
say, well, you explained it to me like I'm 5. Well, we are hopefully doing a good job of getting things out there in a way that doesn't overcomplicate things and
Right.
helps people to digest what we're telling them.
Yeah. Yeah.
I hope that answers.
It does. I mean, I think that telling history and recovering history and framing history is a component of nation building and national identity in a certain way, right? They when we imagine it, these things really interlink and support one another really, really powerfully. Otherwise, right, somebody else is owning and telling your history, and how does that affect nation building in other ways, right? Economic development, education, whatever. So I think you answered it. They're really closely tied as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I want to kind of talk, since we're talking a little bit about history work, and that's sort of where I'm moving this conversation, I guess. So you've worked in archives, you've talked about research, you've talked about the excitement of finding things and sharing it, which I can certainly feel. You engage in oral history projects, you conduct them. There are existing oral history projects that you're aware of. So I want to move this and talk a little bit about archives, the archive itself, and maybe have you tell me a little bit about your experience in archives. And I'm even moving more specifically in this question is sort of the nature of the archive, often as a colonial institution. That archives have been set up, organized by non-natives in this particular case. And so as you are doing your kind of history work, and then you're engaging with these legacy institutions, sort of tell me a little bit about that. Jen, maybe you can talk a little bit about it.
Sure. So as a journalist, an investigative journalist, I have worked in archives, gone down many rabbit holes on many different topics, and there's nothing more exciting than digging in to your rabbit hole and finding everything that you're looking for and having all those little aha moments to create the body of work that you need to tell your story. I will say that once I started working for my tribe and looking through archives from that perspective, I will say, it shifted quite a bit in that I think it's wonderful that we have resources to be able to tell our story, but it leaves you a little conflicted when you're having to ask permission to see a document or to license and pay for the use of a document that is your people's. It should belong to your peoples, or
Right.
It originated from your people. And so I know really wonderful people, though, who work in museums and archives that have just rolled out the red carpet for us and said, you guys can make yourselves at home. And so you feel a little conflicted. It's the system that we are currently having to work within. But I know there is a push from Cherokee Nation's leadership to regain access and control over some of our items that are in archives throughout the United States. And that was I was so excited to hear that an effort was being put into that. And I know there are museums currently who are handing over things back to tribes, and that's exciting too. But yeah, I think that I want to say also that, we recently took a trip to a very large archive and library in a major city, and it was very apparent that other Native Americans had been there before us and laid the groundwork for what I believe is a totally different environment than what people before us experienced.
Yeah.
Because they had policies and procedures in place for us to feel welcome and have access and feel as much as welcome as we could.
Right.
So yeah.
That's a big step on their part. Yeah. LeeAnn?
It's been a really interesting journey in sort of learning, as Jen said, that I think one of the things that is frustrating to find out is that so many of our documents and so much of our history is out there in someone else's hands. And, we would love for that to all come back to us. We haven't until recently really had an archival space to hold things. We're fixing that. We have a very nice research center and archive with a vault and climate controlled and all of that that's in Tahlequah, and I think we're in the process of putting something larger together. And so those are, that space holds really important things to us, like the land grant patent that we were given that gives us the right to Cherokee Nation as a land base. And so all of those things, within our archive, that's great. Then you go out and you sort of start looking at, where are these other things? And I want to echo that historians everywhere are so great, and they are so excited when we want to come see these things that maybe haven't seen the light of day for a long time. They really do roll out the red carpet for us. We were in Charleston earlier in 2024 and went to several different places that, they just were so kind and had really looked at things ahead of time for us and tried to have those things ready for us. Here closer to home, we have this fantastic relationship with Oklahoma Historical Society and with Gilcrease Museum.
Yeah.
And so we can go to, say, Gilcrease, and they'll pull out, they have these wonderful collections of things like Principal Chief John Ross's papers.
Oh, yes.
They have detachment lists that are, these people traveled on the forced removal, and, here are their names, here's who went with them, here's who led them, and those sorts of things. And to sit there and hold that in your hand, it gives you chills. And so we're very grateful for the places that have held on to these things and at least made them available. Even if they're not in our hands, we know they're in good hands. We hope they come back to us someday. But, in the meantime, at least we have very good rapport when we've gone out. I can't think of any place that hasn't been very excited to talk with us and to be helpful.
That's good to know, and it speaks to a change, and perhaps the difference between conceiving of collections as being ownership, but more towards stewardship, right? That maybe that's what we're talking about.
And one thing too, just to add to that, is that sometime back we didn't have all these digital archives, and that has made a tremendous difference in how we research things, what's available to us. How there are things that, maybe they're over in someplace in Great Britain or something, and we're able to actually see that, look at it. We're able to look at news articles in British newspapers that talk about when Cherokees went to visit King George, or, what sometimes they thought we were interesting enough in the 1800s to just report about us. And that's kind of fascinating to me to see that they thought we were interesting enough to read a little something about us. And we would not know that if it wasn't for all of these digital spaces that exist. So we're really, I think, encouraged by seeing that, because those take a tremendous amount of time. It takes someone's great diligence to do that. And it takes patience and the willingness to sit there and mark all of those things, scan them, give them, some sort of a nomenclature, and put them out there for us to be able to see.
Absolutely. And I think that when you're describing it that way, it reminds us that one of the kind of aspects or results of colonialism is the scattering of the history, right? And the pieces are in England, and they're in this city, they're in that place, and they part of perhaps the project that you're working on is regathering, right? And reassembling. And I think that's really important history work, right? Yeah.
I have had many moments where my jaw has dropped and I've thought, how in the world did that end up there?
Yeah.
And then you find out, sometimes people buy collections and then you see some of the things that are in those collections, and it just makes your stomach hurt. But yeah, I think that people are starting to understand how problematic those things have been in the past, and hopefully there is a.
And as you've also said, the hurdles that you face in accessing the history of your people, it speaks to this sort of power dynamic that really is important to talk about, really important to consider as part of this conversation. So when you're talking about these sorts of things, I'm also thinking about the development of the next generation of Cherokee historians. So maybe you can reflect on sort of where your role is in that, in this sort of continuing story of developing this kind of capacity.
I think everyone who works for the Cherokee Nation, in whatever capacity it is somehow probably inspiring the next generation of Cherokee people that understand and know their history. People like LeeAnn probably have a much bigger influence on creating historians. But I think everyone who works specifically on our productions becomes somewhat of a historian. And we have a lot of young people that work for us. And I don't know. I think that through our projects that people will be inspired. And I know that I've heard a lot from teachers, and professors, but all grades, that they constantly tell us that we watch Osiyo TV in my class. I do quizzes based off of it. And I hear from students too, Sometimes students will say like, oh yeah, my teacher makes me watch that. But usually they say like, oh no, we love watching your show. And I always ask like, what did what's your favorite story or whatever? And they usually have a good answer. So people are paying attention. Yeah.
Cool. I love that.
It is one of those things where, if you're lucky, you have mentors that are willing to sit with you or answer your million questions that you have. I was really blessed to have several people like that once I sort of got the bug and knew which direction I wanted to go. I probably just burned up their phones and their email asking them, for questions. And, some of them are gone now. And it's sort of a legacy, that I wonder, well, who's going to take over when I'm gone, when Jen's gone? Who's going to keep on telling those stories? And I am very encouraged by all of this. We do hear so much from people that use the stories in their classroom and just from people across all walks of life who tell us that, they've learned something from us. I don't think you can ask for better than that.
Not really. I think that's wonderful. So what I want to do now is move to a couple of final questions. Thank you so much for that. That was just really wonderful. And we have a couple of questions that we ask all of our guests on Good History. So I want to begin with that. And so the first one sort of goes like this, that in our time, these days, 21st century, history and the humanities are struggling to demonstrate our relevance to college students and I suppose the public generally. We're told that focusing on history is a bad career move. You'll end up as a barista or something like that. Now, saying that, I like baristas just fine. So I don't think that's a slight in the slightest, as it were. At the same time, we have that conversation. Why study history? Why bother with this? Americans, and you were just alluding to this, consume history enthusiastically. We buy books. We watch Netflix documentaries we turn into Osiyo. We enjoy Hollywood films set in historical periods. We appeal to history all the time. This is the part that's really intriguing to me. Think of debates and discussions that a lot of us have about contemporary issues and how often we hear somebody say, well, history tells us, and then fill in the blank from there, right? So there's constant kind of appeal to history. And so what intrigues me, and one of the motivating considerations for this podcast is that apparent paradox between history struggling for oxygen when we're talking about education and universities or K through 12 or these kinds of things, and then its popularity outside the walls of academy. There's this sort of paradox, right? And seems to operate in that direction opposite what one might think. So I wonder if you have any kind of reflections on sort of the state of history and humanities, and that on the one hand, we don't talk about it as a valuable thing to study. And on the other hand, people are talking about it all the time.
Everybody's attention span has gotten a lot shorter. I'll start with that. There's so many things that have had to be sort of condensed, or, people don't have the patience to sit and read and consume things in the way that they might once have. It's hard to get somebody to sit down and read a 400-page history book, or to go through some of those things. It also depends on who academically is dispensing the history, that kind of thing. But I think what we're doing is we're sort of helping bridge that gap. Maybe we're a little bit of the Cliff Notes. I don't know. But, you see lots and lots of award-winning programs like, John Adams, or I think recently there was one with Michael Douglas as Benjamin Franklin, and that are getting really good ratings. There's also lots and lots of historic movies that are more in these maybe the last 10 or 20 years that are doing better. I think about how popular Outlander is as a series. And, that's sort of giving people a very palatable way to consume history, where they don't feel like they're actually consuming history, but yet it's getting through.
Nice.
So that's where I think that disconnect is maybe morphed over a little bit.
Yeah, that's interesting.
It's worrisome to me that people don't see the value in teaching history in any school setting. I think that history is so important. And for us to have people who actually become historians, those are the people who are writing the books that help us to understand not only our history, but our life ways of where we are today. And I worry about a time when no matter what the way people are consuming our history, I worry about heading toward the movie Idiocracy. We are not looking at history, to be quite frank.
Yeah.
And I don't like to think about that. So I hope people will continue to consume and understand the importance of our history and consume it however you need to have that understanding. But how can we move forward in an intelligent way if we don't understand the past and how it informs what we're doing right now?
Yeah, amen. I think there's a lot to that. And there's more than one part. And this is what speaks to this paradox. People are kind of interested in history, and yet our students and kids are told, don't study history, you won't get a job. And you think, well, maybe there's another way to frame that.
Yeah.
Another way to talk about that, right? Citizenship, perhaps, right? Okay, well, that's great. Our last question. And we'll start with you on this, Jen. And our last question is what we call the party question. And it kind of goes like this. When you're in gatherings of one sort or another, you may field questions about history, given what you do. I imagine you do field questions about history. If you had to decide, what would be the question you wish somebody would ask you?
The question that if I got to decide what a person was going to ask me about history, LeeAnn, you probably already know what I'm going to say. I would love it if people would ask, how do you know if you are a Cherokee Nation citizen and actually do have a connection to the tribe?
Nice. That's a great question. How do you answer that?
We talk about how Cherokee Nation citizens, to be a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, you link back to a person who is listed on the Dawes rolls, and that the tribe essentially knows that you are a citizen of their tribe. There are a lot of stories and family narratives that have been passed down that the Cherokee people are probably the tribe that people claim the most,
right,
with no evidence of that. And we understand all of those family histories. But being that I am the host of a Cherokee television show and people know that I'm Cherokee, I can't tell you how many times when I'm at gatherings, people tell me that they're also Cherokee, but they don't have a membership card or something along those lines. So that's something that I would love if people, instead of telling me that they're Cherokee, but they can't prove it, I would love it if people would instead maybe come at it from a different perspective and say, how can I find out if I am? And we have a great answer for that. We connect people with our genealogists, and maybe you are, but we have a way to find out.
Fantastic. I love that. LeeAnn.
Well, if it were up to me, something that I think would be so interesting to explore and talk about would be to have someone come up and say, what would this area be like? What would this nation be like if the colonizers had never come across the ocean? What would be here?
Right.
And how would we have progressed? And to really spin that out and think about, what would have happened if this had remained a country of native nations? Where would we be today? And what kind of innovations would we have made? The history would certainly be quite different. And, we wouldn't have had things like smallpox decimating people or some of the other things that were happening. So, and we might also have still some of our cultural aspects might be stronger and things that hadn't been lost, because there are, as we know, there are some of those things that, are lost and maybe can't even be recovered. But I think that would be a fun thing to talk with somebody about, just the what if.
I love that, because we sometimes get trapped in this idea that there's an inevitability to the way history unfolds, when it's actually a consequence of all kinds of actions and all kinds of forks in the road or whatever. There's nothing inevitable about any of this, right? And so the nice thing about that question is you can kind of push back and say, this wasn't inevitable. There was, there were all kinds of other factors, right, in play. Well, that's fantastic. So I want to thank you, LeeAnn Dreadfulwater and Jen Loren, for joining us today. And on behalf of the Good History team, my colleague, Sarah Griswold, who is really the creative force behind a lot of this, Libby Whitlow, graduate student in our department who doubles as a social media intern, and Jesse Ulrich, who's a chief executive of Rant 9 Productions, our Good History producer and a trained historian, which kind of makes our point about history work, right? There he does. He embodies it himself. And our tagline is, remember, the only bad history is history we don't know. So with that, thank you so much.
Wado.
Thank you for having us.